asked to moderate this panel because the moderator listed, incidentally, is attending a meeting of executives of CAAS. So I'm standing in for the original moderator here. But that's just as well because the panel is my idea, and I've had to work with Blair and Martin to put this together. Briefly, we thought that since the opportunity of the CAAS conference was within reach, that we could solicit cooperation from other Banting postdoctoral fellows in Canada. The Banting postdoctoral fellow is a relatively new initiative of Canadian government to attract some of the most distinguished scholars from different parts of the world to Canada to conduct research. And so it's not looking at, and then while originally we had thought about 5 of us, or 6, and then at the last minute, Erin couldn't make it because her daughter took ill, and so she couldn't join us. But fortuitously, we are lucky to have another Banting scholar here who has presented in a different panel, and who gave a very fascinating presentation. So we thought to bring together this interesting research is being conducted across of Canada in a panel. So, and then also to provide opportunity for us to interact, to know one another, and to see the kind of work that we're doing, and hope that we can get support of one another and from network going forward. So that's pretty much the idea behind the panel. And we requested that the researchers, the Banting scholars, many of them very established scholars already in their own field, from Germany, from Mexico, from different parts of the world, doing great work in their different places before coming to Canada through this very prestigious fellowship. I am at the Institute of African Studies, and my name is Nduka Otieno. So I'm moderating. What I propose that we do is very simple and straightforward. We'll have, according to how we are listed, unless we opt otherwise, to make our presentation. So we have 3 of us presenting instead of 4 that is listed. So we have Nelson here, and then we have Martin. Martin is also in Carleton. And then Janelle is not here, but we have Nduka. And then when we finish, we'll open up the discussion. I know that many of you are itching to hear what we have. One of the things I can assure you for coming to this panel is that at some point you will certainly get ready to dance, because there's music being part of this panel. It's just as well because some of us do some kind of very crazy research. So you're welcome. I will at this point invite Dr. Nelson Rosa Becerra. How do you call the last name? Becerra, so I got it. Dr. Nelson Rosa Becerra received his PhD in history at Universidade Federal Fluminense, Brazil in April 2010. He is currently a Banting postdoctoral fellow in the Harare Tubman Institute, York University. He has published 5 books, among them as chairs, and then he has some of the titles there in Spanish. In Portuguese, excuse me. I tend to mix Portuguese and looking at, so excuse me. And then he will be presenting on slavery and African diaspora in Brazil through biographies, Mohamed Gado Bakwapa's case. Just to give you a foretaste of what it is, okay, let me over to you. Okay. And so, since there are 3 of us and we have 1.5 hours, we can do 15 minutes each. So
it's great.
Or 20 minutes. That will give us 20 minutes.
20 is great.
Yeah, so you have 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for discussion.
Thanks so much, Nituka. Martin. My paper when Niduka invited me, so in fact, I've just submitted uh, another paper for another panel, and it was about my project in the Bente Fellow program. So I took this paper uh, because it is one parallel project what I'm doing together my Bentley supervisor in York University, Professor Paul Lovejoy. Slavery and Africa Diaspora in Brazil through biographies. Mahoma Gardo Bakwaqua's case. Mahoma Gardo Bakwaqa was an important African voice in the Atlantic world. His autobiography reveals different aspects of African life in the Americas. Although we know a little about his passage through Brazil, further research on Bakwaqua's life can further our understanding of slavery in the Americas. Newly found Brazilian documents on Bakwaqua's life and work on board ships in Rio de Janeiro and the Rio Grande do Sul have recently come to light. I intended to explore this new information in the context of Bakwaqua's road from freedom in Africa to slavery in Brazil. Thus, it will be possible to learn more about the origin of those African slaves sent to Brazil in the 19th century. Mahamo Gardo Bakwaqa authored his own biography after obtaining freedom in United States. His narrative offers interesting details about many economic, social, and cultural issues related to the era of the Atlantic slave trade. Few have written on the life of Bakwaqa. His autobiography was edited once in 1854, but in 2007, Rob Law and Paul Lovejoy published a new version of Bakwaqua's biography, as well as a series of articles. This paper aims to contribute to this body of literature. Law and Lovejoy provide important information about Bakwaqa in Brazil, but there exists a possibility of extending this research in local archive. This paper intends to make some connection between Bakwaqua's life and the general future of the slavery in Brazil during the 19th century. Bakwaqa was enslaved from a young age. He was born in Jogo, present-day Nigeria, and they brought to Brazil, moving from Pernambuco, Rio de Janeiro, and the Rio Grande do Sul. Pay attention, Bakwaqa had a busy life because he was in different places around the Atlantic world, and only Brazil he was minimum for 3 different provinces: Pernambuco, Rio de Janeiro, and Rio Grande do Sul. Following 2 years after Rio Grande do Sul, he traveled to New York with his master, where he finally escaped to freedom. He subsequently traveled to Haiti, the United States again, Canada, and finally England, where he intended to go back to Africa. According to Law and Lovejoy, Bakwaqa arrived in Brazil in 1845. He came through an Atlantic road from West Africa to Pernambuco in Brazil. However, he did not stay long in Pernambuco, having become an alcoholic according to his master. Therefore, he was sold to a maritime captain who commanded an embarkation from Pernambuco to Rio de Janeiro. Once settled on board, Bakwaqa began to write about his voyage and new master, commander of the ship Lembrança. It set sail for New York City in 1847, where Bacuaco abandoned ship and fled for freedom. The study of the African diaspora must consider the perspective of the African slave. Has, although difficult to consider few sources available. When historians write about slavery history, they multiply that document. It is necessary to present a history from the perspective of the African slave. Once in the United States, Bacuaco became a participant of the abolition movement. His narrative illustrates the African world in the America. Working in Brasília Archive in Rio de Janeiro and the Rio Grande do Sul, I found new information about the owner of the embarkation Lembrança, where Bacuaco worked as a slave. I believe this information about this ship may provide a better understanding of Bacuaco's life in Brazil. Prior to Bacuaco's escape, he worked on the ship Lembrança. He was a personal slave to the captain of the embarkation. Normally, Bacuaco traveled with his master on various voyages through Brazil Atlantic ports. We know the Lembrança arrived in New York from Rio de Janeiro, where Bacuaco had been many times. This information provides Bacuaco new slave life in Rio de Janeiro. As stated by historian Mary Carrash, according to her, the city was strange. Many African slaves remained in front of houses as stories, sings about their families and the African tradition, remembering their past life. The past lived in Brazil for a long period of time. They failed to forget their homeland. Some of them returned to Africa, while most believed in an eventual return to Africa after death. Bacuaco's life exhibited a dream for freedom. He missed his family and, as many others, he intended to back to Africa. He held a unique point of view of the Atlantic world through his life as a slave in Rio de Janeiro. Still, we don't know much about his life in Rio de Janeiro or Rio Grande do Sul. At this context, my research on Bacuaco in Rio de Janeiro and Rio Grande do Sul brings to light new documents about the owner and the captain of Lembrança. Therefore, I hope to elaborate on Bacuaco's life in Rio through an investigation about the people with whom he has some wrong. Antônio José da Rocha Pereira, the owner of Lembrança, was a merchant in Rio de Janeiro. He was born in Portugal and arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1810. At 70 years old, he participated of the Royal Board of Trade in Brazil, where he became a merchant. He lived in Rua de Direita, it is a Direita Street in Rio, a commercial division in downtown Rio de Janeiro, and married with Maria Rosa Leite in 1837. According to a local almanac, the Almanac Lamet, Rocha Pereira may have had a relative by the name of the João Antônio da Rocha Pereira. He owned a market and another wine store in 20 São Pedro Street. This demonstrates that Bacuaco approached some commercial activities. A non-exhaustive investigation of the newspaper Diário do Rio de Janeiro between January and February of the 1846 led me to some embarkation arriving and departing from Rio de Janeiro. During these trips, a cabotage trade was explored, helping to understand the circulation of commodities and the people. Many vessels were used in cabotage among Brazilian provinces, and many slaves were employed among the crew. People working on board had the opportunity to see different places and explore other cultures. It was the Bacuacua's case too. Despite the fact that the chart offers a little on the total volume, I have deduced some important questions. José Antônio da Rocha Pereira had an interesting way of running his business. His commercial activity was to buy, to transport, and to sell commodities to different places on the Brazilian coast. This is not a new in Brazilian historiography, but it reveals an importance to learn about new cultural transformation. Most importantly, it helps us better understand Bacuapa, the captain and the owner of embarkation. According to record of national embarkation of cabotage and long distance in 1847, Antônio José Pereira da Rocha was the owner of more five embarcations, including the Lembrança. Chart 2 shows that Antônio José Pereira da Rocha was a merchant of cabotage with many resources, and Lembrança and its crew, including Bacuaca, were part of it. This vessel carried many goods, and it was used in trip to New York City, and the time Bacuaca escaped. I have found that, in fact, Clement was the captain of Lembrança. During this voyage, while Captain Costa commanded Lembrança from 1841. I found three registers in Rio Grande do Sul which demonstrate that this vessel was owned by José Antônio Pereira da Rocha and was commanded by Captain Clement José da Costa. Clement José da Costa was the Bacuacua's owner. From 1841, they brought food, slaves, and the other commodities between Rio de Janeiro, Rio Grande do Sul, and Santa Catarina. This provides a way to comprehend Bacuapa in the context of the African slavery in Brazil. Our embarkation had an owner and were usually commanded by a captain, and at least part of the crew were African slaves. Regarding my method on navigating this biography, my intention is to cross information about Clemente José da Costa with those about Bacuapa, try to identify events related to them in different moments of his autobiography. Bacuapa says that the captain of Lembrança was his master. Maybe Bacuapa's Christ name, José da Costa, is the most important indication of his relationship. Therefore, information about Clemente José da Costa can uncover Bacuapa's life under slavery in Brazil. As a captain, Clemente José da Costa had some rights. According to Brazilian historian Jaime Rodrigues, he was the representative of the owner, with the authority to command the embarkation and the crew. His main obligation was the navigation itself, the command and the management of the voyage. I found a maritime captain, Clemente José da Costa, listed as a voter in Rio Grande do Sul between 1848 and 1859. This man had 4 slaves, and he registered the deaths during this period. Of course, Bacuaca was not in the list since he was alive at the time, and the list of the 1847 belonged to Clement, lived to the United States in 1847. In 1866, Clemente da Costa gave the freedom for one baby, Teresa. She was 7 months old, and his mother, Rufina, both were slaves. He freed her because he wanted to baptize that baby as she was born free. However, our captain was not an employer his whole life. He was an embarkation owner as well. I found a register where José Clemente da Costa appears as a buyer of one embarkation called Escuna Oliveira by 2 contos de réis. It was almost 100,000 pounds. Lourenço Gomes de Oliveira sold it to him through his procurate Manuel Pereira Jardim. Therefore, I am sure that Bacuaco's owner was a man from Rio Grande do Sul and not of Rio de Janeiro, although he was a marito. So, he knew and had business around different places. We may deduce that Bacuaco lived in Rio Grande do Sul during his short life under slavery in Brazil, but he traveled among Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, and Rio de Janeiro sometimes. Rio Grande was an important port in Brazil and for the Atlantic world as a strategic locally. According to Naomi Kinosh, the port of the Rio Grande had the third position on movement of embarkation from Rio de Janeiro. According to Vinicius de Oliveira, connection south navigation and port support marines of different Brazilian ports. I'm sure its favored marine slave to multicultural experience, included Bacuaco. Rio Grande was a strategic port for trades in commodities in the south of Brazil, as it provides passage to the Rio da Prata in Argentina currently. Thus, there was regular commercial connection between Rio de Janeiro and Rio Grande, and Bacuaco should have been part of this trade as a slave of Captain Clemente da Costa. To better understand this voyage, I return to Almanac Lambert, which provides information about the embarkation on the following routes. They usually carried between between 100 tonnage. Often the plan was the travel from Rio de Janeiro to Rio Grande do Sul and then back to Rio de Janeiro, with many stops in between such as Santa Catarina. The total cost used to be around almost 1 million pounds. We can see details of the value in the next chart. Chart 3 shows the payment of various crew and the provisions, including slaves such as Bacuaco. However, I cannot state definitely that he lived in Rio de Janeiro, because his master could be the one from Rio Grande. The word of Bacuaco supports this second possibility. Bacuaco never made this clear. He does describe how frequently he used the actually stay on board. In the Bacuaco's word, he said, our first voyage was the Rio Grande. The voyage itself was pleasant enough had I not suffered with sickness. The harbor at the Rio Grande is rather shallow, and the uninterred we searched the ground, as it happened as low water, and he had great difficulty in getting her to float again. I found the same information in Brazilian document that confirmed how Bacuaco described the harbor of Rio Grande in great details. He hints that they made various voyages. According to him, he stayed in Rio de Janeiro for 1 month, supported the idea that he did not permanently live in Rio. Rather, he frequented that city. In another part of his biography, Bacuaco said one day it was necessary for me to go ashore with my master. Therefore, it is clear both were living in the ship and not in the city of Rio de Janeiro. Clemente da Costa could be from Rio Grande, but not Rio de Janeiro, where Bacuaco declared he stayed on board with the crew. His name was in Rio Grande's list of electors, and he laced men had 4 slaves and was registered as a seaman. Bacuaco wrote that his slave status could make him a lost person, leaving him hopeless. When he saw a possibility for freedom, he took it. He fought for abolition and wrote his autobiography as a free man, as a contribution to this movement. His life is important to better understand the African slave perspectives. Still, there is a little information in his autobiography about his time in Brazil. My effort is to expand this knowledge. In order to do this, I must continue research for new data on his master and those with whom he lived. By doing this, I hope to contribute to the discourse on Africa voice on the Brazilian slavery and the African diaspora in the 19th century in Brazil. Thank you so much.
So I would suggest that you take one of our questions and then we take all of them at the end of the presentation so that we have a more holistic discussion. The Brazilian origins and the extensions of Papa's life towards providing more information about early slaves in Brazil. I already see an interesting connection that we can take up later on because there is another Nigerian who just had a final, Olaudah final, who also made a similar trip, but this time to Europe. So it'd be nice to see if there are any intersections at the end of it. As I said early on, before some of you came in, the beauty of the panel is that we have people from very diverse places. The next speaker is originally from Germany, and the title of his presentation is called Flows, Fancies, and Fruits: African Migration, European Union Migration, Control in Morocco, and Almera's Agricultural Industry. Dr. Martin Geiger holds a German diploma, minors political science and sociology, and a doctoral degree in geography from the University of Bonn, Germany. His research, teaching, and writing focus on migration from an interdisciplinary perspective. Primary concerns are the multitude of state and non-state actors involved in governing cross-border mobility today, the various modes and tools that have been invented to, quote, manage flows of people, and the real-life effects of these interventions have on societies, political systems, and persons crossing or intentionally not crossing borders. That's an interesting twist. And his talk brings in the audience to different sites from the Straits of Gibraltar through Morocco, Ceuta, Melilla, and the hothouses of Almeria. Sites that share a common historical past and have symbolic dangers, symbolic for the ongoing struggle of African migrants to reach Europe's shores, to belong to a new place, the dangers and exploitation African migrants are often confronted with and subjected to. And he provides more details in his paper. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Martin to give the presentation.
Thank you for putting together this panel. And I take in this paper a bit more a biographical turn, talking about myself and a bit my path as a researcher. How do we get this big? Yeah, I see it. It's always these different versions. All right. In this talk, as mentioned, I want to take you to some of my sites of previous research and inform you a bit about what I've studied and learned there, and where also I think my research results add to this interdisciplinary studies of mobility and migration, but also studies on the European Union and its external relations, the global transformation of politics, and some other aspects. Picture. All right. For me as a scholar, a primary field research at sites where processes are taking place and real life is happening is very important, and I see these experiences as fundamental in shaping my personality and path of life, not only as a researcher, instructor, communicator, scholar, but you learn a lot of, for example, about being a EU citizen or what the European Union is all about when you actually go to the border, the rims of the EU, and into the so-called neighborhood and beyond this area. So let's start in southern Spain, in beautiful Andalusia, the old Andalus, a traditional region of emigration that in the past sent hundreds of thousands of emigrants to other regions in Spain, Europe, the New World, but also northern parts of Morocco. Andalusia, until today, experiences net emigration, what concerns Spanish native population, while it has become since the 1990s also a major destination and hub for migrants, travelers, and could become immigrants for many parts of the world. Interestingly, the constitution of the Comunidad Autónoma, the autonomous region of Andalusia, in its preamble mentions that Andalusians should never forget the emigration experience of the ancestors, and due to history should remain open, tolerant, and support those who want to live in Andalusia and those of need. So that's also a bit in this Tierra Hospitalitaria, what's mentioned there, a hospital region. And of course, you know also Andalusia or Almeria, the region I'm talking about. Well, it's also a famous destination for tourists, and especially Germans and British people that also become migrants at one point, then buy houses and live there. What you see here is a now already at least 10-year-old satellite imagery I used when presenting my first ever academic project, my diploma project, to my supervisors at Bonn University, Germany. What you can see here is another picture of Andalusia. Some of its provinces, and this is Almeria, are today highly dependent on agriculture. Andalusia is home of one of the biggest hothouse agricultural industries in the world. The province of Almeria is European-wide and globally a prime producer for tomatoes, peppers, other vegetables, fruits, and flowers. The satellite image pictures, however, not only the business and the towns, but also the interrelation between this industry and migration. And actually, it also pictures the housing of a huge number of migrant workers who, in reality, really live under plastic themselves because they try to build their shelters out of plastic waste, try to live close to their employers. Once an impoverished stretch of land, dictator Franco, spurred by an ambitious rural development plan, the advent of this modern agricultural industry. He promised small pieces, small lots of land and state support to landless populations from Andalusia and other parts of Spain. They moved here, fought with malaria, fought with nature, through their creativity, but also simply because they had to survive. They tried out different kinds of planting, in a longer process created a highly innovative agriculture that then became a source of wealth, turning many of the towns in bigger metropolises, turning the farmer population and other inhabitants of this zone in a population with one of the highest incomes and living standards in Spain. So this is former housing of the farmers, the Spanish that were settled there when Franco colonized this region, so-called. And today you see these contrasts of the migrant worker and the BMW on the streets, and this region actually sells most Porsches in whole Spain, and you see a lot of very luxurious cars. First, based on the self-exploitation of the farmer's own family workforce, the agricultural model already in the 1970s started to become dependent on casual migrant labor. The former landless, who had migrated seasonally to other parts of Spain and Europe themselves to earn some small income, had become proprietors. Optimal adaptation to natural conditions generated good income, though most of them only possessed and cultivated small stretches of land. The Gitanos, the Sinti and Roma living in the region, became their first labor force. Soon these groups were blamed to be unreliable, conflictive, lazy, dangerous, and these are all quotations. The farmers, as, in words of Elias, the newly established, decided to go for another workforce, Moroccan laborers. Here another side of my previous research comes into the picture, northern Morocco, a region that was always intrinsically connected to the northern rim of the Straits of Gibraltar. Seasonal, temporary, short-term migration and mobility to work in the emerging agricultural industry of Almeria until the 1990s wasn't a problem that it is today. What we experience and what we see today, or since the accession of Spain to the European community in 1986, is an intense fortification of this historically never really divided region on both sides of the Straits of Gibraltar, the Estrecho, a region that more or less unwillingly was turned into one of the EU's most pivotal border and control regions. The EU in its policy documents, the media, but also many researchers often use the expression of regions of origin and regions of destination as if these spatial entities were separate from each other, would be easy to differentiate. This is echoed by pull and push assumptions in migration theory, but also in EU and media discourse, migration as something caused by inequalities concerning wages, the contrast between the so-called good and the so-called bad, non-democratic governance, and so on. Looking at this region now, one can easily see that there is no clear-cut differentiation and that borders are absolute artificial inventions and interventions in a region that was always characterized by connectivities, the power of links and networks, complex systems of social relations, also inside these artificially, territorially contained, bounded societies. So you see here, this is a way the European Union tries to regulate the entry of day laborers and day people that want to sell goods in, that's in Ceuta, inside Ceuta on Spanish territory. So people have to queue here in the sun, wait for hours until they get access, and this is then probably regulated. Mobility is disciplined. I'll come back to this later. See, for example, also, I talked about this society in internal stratification of societies. See, for example, the former landless migrants, Spanish migrants, turned into, in some cases, quite wealthy managers and employers. The roulette that is played by these farmers, substituting one labor force, the Gitanos, by Moroccans, and then going on with other groups. Also, what you see here and what we clearly understand in this region is that history matters. Sometimes we get the feeling in the EU documents, or also what many migration managers in publications say, that if this would be now a new trend, that there's migration is soaring up and that's a new trend, migration is increasing and so on. But we have to understand that this region was never really divided and the borders really make the problem. In the context of this extreme, sometimes extreme labor exploitation, hostile attacks on Moroccans and other agricultural workers, and even semi-organized pogroms, local farmers still proudly showed me the Alcazaba, the old Moorish fortress topping Almeria, and asked if I have already gone up the hill and looked down on their Poniente and all the great farm production that is going on. Some of them then got abruptly quiet when I asked them, probably from up there you can also see Morocco sometimes. Yes. The blame, however, is not only in the farmers. While some of them really adopt aggressive, exploitative methods, they are also victims of market forces. They have been trapped in a situation where they cannot really influence on market dynamics, and big multinational companies that have come into this region. Andalusia and Almeria share a lot of features of many of these so-called arrival zones or contexts or regions of destination. A temporary state of exception, so is said, has become more and more a permanent state of exception, though migration mobility was always a normal feature of life. While there's today great talk about allowing temporary seasonal migration, the real problem that this does not work in reality are the very borders that have been erected. Before there was always temporary mobility, also agriculture has changed. So you still hear a lot of narratives about the so-called temporary worker that is sometimes in the year needed in agriculture production, but then we don't need these people and they can return or they can go somewhere else. But the whole agricultural industry I have depicted is now more or less an industry that works throughout the year, and there's several harvests per year, so the whole construction of a temporary worker is also flawed. These borders, in my view, serve the function of making and keeping people vulnerable, keeping them exploitable, keeping them locked in a situation, potentially deportable at any time without rights. That's a zone of connectivities, a zone of mobility that was in the context of EU policies turned into a zone of exception. We tolerate the loss of life. We tolerate extreme forms of exploitation. The migrants' hopes and aspirations are taken into account. They are really instrumentalized. Farmers make use of these aspirations and hopes, keeping them to some extent alive and allowing for a state of circulation where migrants stay in a limbo, get the informal promise to be employed daily again and paid. Therefore, don't lose the hope to have soon a better life, to make maybe the trip to Madrid at one point, or at least to remit money home, or following a forced or voluntary return, they deliberately even opt to try it again, to cross the estrecho, though again risking their lives and their health. Borders are one of the tools that keep people exploitable, but yet they are so simplistic and sometimes a rather helpless response of states that fail. They simply fail to develop more adequate migration and also labor policies, that fail in fighting against xenophobia and fail in fighting exploitation in their own territory. States, to some extent, have also undoubtedly lost control over flows. And with flows, I mean not only flows of people, but various kinds of flows. See again the example of Spain and Morocco. When I came the first time here, the local newspaper talked about a so-called Guerra del Tomate, a war of the tomatoes. Spanish farmers went down to the harbor of Almeria and simply threw the Moroccan tomatoes in the water because they feared the impact of cheaper agricultural products on their market for Morocco. And yet the EU at the same time was negotiating a free trade agreement with Morocco at that time, covering agricultural products. In fact, free trade, I learned, and maybe this sounds now a bit naive, impacts on the life of the migrant laborers. The price of products governs the price of their labor condition. So Moroccans on both sides of the estrecho, Moroccan tomatoes fighting with Spanish tomatoes, and Moroccans actually harvesting the tomatoes. Then another example, how states have lost control over flows and populations. Though they keep rigorously to demonstrate control and try to react with more offenses, the EU also grew over time. While Spain exceeded in the late 1980s, there were newcomers. Even before the entry of Eastern European states into the EU, due to the downfall of communism and other market forces, Almeria not only started to employ people from south of the Sahara and from Morocco, but also from the east of Europe. The result, local towns that now accommodate more than 120 nationalities, while this simultaneously showed a dramatic increase of population, sometimes 20 times fold in less than 10 years, making the whole local context extremely difficult to govern, one has to agree. Though there are many difficulties and challenges, hostilities and extreme violence exist, one must also say that the whole situation is far more stable and far more friendly than one can expect, especially if you come from a country like Germany, where you're always told all these migrants coming to Germany, they create a problem, this is too many people and so on. If you come there and you are overwhelmed with these numbers and figures, you would expect, being brainwashed in that way, you would expect something else. An important part of my research, since that time I did this research, focuses on these effects and to various degrees also intended or unintended consequences of local, national, regional, and global migration politics. In my research, a key question is also the question simply, where is migration policy made and by whom is power exercised? During my PhD research, I have left this region of southern Spain and northern Morocco and have shifted my attention to the eastern rim of Europe. Though patterns and challenges there are different, both regions, as many border regions neighboring the EU, share similarities. My PhD work focuses on the proliferation of actors and instruments that contribute to render mobility flows and people manageable. International organizations, NGO, and many other actors, including private businesses today, play an important role in the translation and implementation of so-called migration management. And it's not always the actors that are most obvious and most prominent in media discourse, such as EU Frontex, the border agency, that matter most. It is not in all cases the drones, smart border gates, and other technologies that are tested worldwide and are in the focus of my Banting research. It's sometimes rather old-style technologies, but they are also sophisticated technologies. Look at this fence. You can climb the first fence maybe, but then you are trapped in between several fences. And the principle works inside, it works like quicksand. You are strapped and you cannot get out yourself because there's a lot of metal going around your feet, and the more you move, the more you get trapped into it. And so they say it's not even hurting the people trapped in. I'm not sure to confirm to this. But this is a rather, let's say, old-style technology, we would say, but it is highly sophisticated. Spain has developed this fence, now tries to sell it somewhere else, especially in the wants to sell it to the US. They were not so successful so far. But this is technologies that are there in place. But there's also a lot of other technologies. Sorry, that was too early. This picture, that's my last picture. There's more technology in place, also social technologies in a more Foucauldian sense, technologies of self-disciplining and influencing on the behavior of people. A common characteristic worldwide is that states have discovered many more ways and instruments that complement traditional approaches to mobility, such as fences, checking passports, issuing visa, checking visas, and so on. There's a proliferation of instruments and techniques that keep people in a really deportable situation, in a situation of being somewhat semi-legal, in a constant limbo. For example, in Almeria, you are employed on a daily basis because you simply go down the street and wait for a farmer to pick you up. And there's no control taking place. So sometimes you could expect to be employed, means you could maybe have a paper, then in the end, if you're regularly employed by the same farmer, and then regularize your status in a so-called amnesty, but you cannot really hope on this. So there's a lot of these techniques keeping you wait for an amnesty, or in between voluntarily returning home to your home country with the help of a service provider like the International Organization for Migration. Population at risk in countries like Morocco are also subjected to information campaigns They showed pictures of the agricultural industry and how fierce life there is, how brutal life there is, just to scare them to stay in their home country and better stay at home. Then there are also instruments that try to make use of their remittances, strategically emphasizing and instrumentalizing their agency, try even to turn them in so-called agents or heroes, Pavati Raghuram, of development. I want to stop here with these rather empirical illustrations and stories, but I'm sure we can come back and there will be some questions and discussion afterwards. One remark I want to make, although, is of course there's a great need now to talk about the policy implications of my research insights. But honestly, for me, one more important goal is, in the last years, was first to investigate and to learn, and not directly to jump into policy advice. One important goal, and you have seen the pictures, for me was always, and that was a bit more important, to bring research results into my own teaching, to equip students, like you can see here, for example, during field trips, to equip students with knowledge they can use later to evaluate these policy statements, media discourses, EU policies, and so on. Discourses of so-called managed migration, migration development, or policy statements they hear in the media at home, why migration policy needs to be restrictive to some extent. And maybe we can also come back to this point later. Thank you very much. Shall I introduce you? How do you introduce yourself?
I think I should.
Yeah, we didn't think about this.
It's okay. Well, I'm Undu Kautino, and I'm participating in this panel, and I'm also chairing the panel. So there's already the burden of chairing the panel. We're 30 minutes to the end of our time. So what I will do is not to go into any details, but to sketch precisely what I had conceived as my presentation, so that we'll have at least about 10-15 minutes for discussion, and then possibly finish early. The title of my presentation is Street Stories. In the post-colonial representations in Nollywood and popular music in an age of globalization. I will try not to go into the details of the film, which is symbolized by Nollywood, and then, pay more attention on the music, because there's really extensive literature on Nollywood, but not so much on the second part of my title, which is on popular music. And so, what I will do is take you quickly into the heart of how I conceive street stories. I will just skim through some PowerPoint to give you a clearer picture of what I mean by street stories, and the kind of ideas that some people have expressed, especially because it cuts across various disciplines, media studies, popular culture, oral literature, and so on and so forth. And so I will just distill that to give you the idea, and then I'll give you a feel of the kinds of texts I'm talking about, represented, and the representations of the ideas in film and popular music. So I begin by looking at this news report that was published in BBC in 2009 by a correspondent for the BBC in Nigeria. His name is Shola Odunfa. And he says, there's only one industry I know in Nigeria which is completely immune to the vagaries of the national economy and the well-oiled machine of the government security and intelligence agencies. It is big, it is strong, it never sleeps, and it is unimaginably creative, but it is invisible. I am talking of the Nigerian rumor mill. Radio Nigeria describes itself as Africa's biggest news network, yet it is puny compared to the awesome rumor mill. If the rumor mill went to sleep, there would be no communication whatsoever between the ruling establishment and the people. And I actually meant to give you a handout or the complete quotation, but the reference is just there, BBC, in case you want to look at it. It's really fascinating because it talks about how important these rumors are for communication, both at the official level in terms of government reliance on it and the people, and how people depend on it, word to mouth and ear to ear, communication. And rumor, because in the idea of street stories, I'm distilling these ideas around narratives that exist that are in the public sphere. So I quickly say that some humanistic conceptions of rumor, this is how some people see rumor. What we all are familiar with, rumors are almost like the air we breathe for human communication. So in the humanities, there's a conception of rumor by Akile Mbembe as a poor man's bomb. And Homi Baba, sees a slender narrative. Karim Baba sees it very interesting, the two Babas, in cultural studies, little genres of everyday life. And then Ropo Shekoni, a Nigerian folklore scholar, sees it as urban folklore, while Anthony Appiah describes it, in terms of gossip, which shares a taproot with literature. I am interested in comparing these conceptions of rumors in the humanities to the conception of rumor in media studies, and I take the central definition by one of the most influential media scholars, Tamotsu Shibutani. So I look at I take his classic media studies oriented definition of rumor as, quote, a substitute, and I really did underline this, to emphasize it. It says it's a substitute for news. In fact, it is news that does not develop in institutional channels. And that far from being pathological, rumor is part and parcel of efforts of men to come to terms with the exigencies of life. Moving from these definitions, I rather transfigure the idea of rumor into street stories, trying to find new terms to describe these kind of narratives that may be mythical, legendary, as in urban legends and so on and so forth. Can we find a way of capturing these kinds of very slippery narratives? And so I use the term street stories specifically to refer to the mythopoetic, if you may, current, and I emphasize the idea they are current affairs texts produced and circulated as weapons of political resistance or sometimes of subversion and compromise in other cases in multiple cultural formations within the post-colonial state, especially in the metropolis with its complex demographics. I also call them traveling texts. So my emphasis is on the city because these rumors and these street stories, also operate in the rural areas. But they find more resonance in the city and they are more effective, in the context that I describe them within the cities. The initial part of my study so far has been Lagos. But I am looking at the parallels of this as they exist in what I call satellite cities across the various regions of Africa. And so I have done field work in Accra. I'll be going to Cairo. I'll be going to Nairobi and Johannesburg to have a feel of this kind of narratives. And then, to compare and see what kinds of parallels or what kinds of differences exist within the post-colonial cities or urban areas in which these stories are retold and circulated. There are parallels, which obviously make it attractive for me to try to explore this. In Southern Africa, there are the Shibin tales, which is actually the Shibin, which is the title of a book by Chenjerai Hove. And I will just show you very quickly. Just to see what this looks like. Yeah, this is Shibin Tales, Messages from Harare. It's not only Harare, one could include Harare, but there are actually more pronouns in South Africa, the country. It's prevalent in Southern Africa, but Chenjerai Hove is one of the leading writers from Zimbabwe. And then this is what he says, throughout Southern Africa. Yes, this is a blog. Shibins are where jokes are born. News, again the idea of news. News is embellished and exchanged. Fights erupt and subside. There are unique vantage points where men go after a day's work. Women do go there too. both to escape from the troubled world around them and observe and comment on it. And then they're also in East Africa, the kind of tourists, that I'm interested in. There's this in what they call the matatu, which is like a transit bus, that is fully packed. We have the equivalent of it in Lagos, Nigeria would be the Modwe or even the Danfo. And then when I went to Accra, the kinds of urban transportation system that is also evident in Lagos is in the trotro, what the Ghanaians call the trotro. Is equivalent of what we call the Danfo in Lagos or the Matatu in East Africa. And this has been theorized. The Matatu is probably the far more theorized of these kinds of discourses, popular discourses, because there are many East African scholars of oral literature who have been fascinated by this phenomenon. And so the key question is, how do street stories mediate and are modulated by the critical press, films, and then specifically Nollywood, popular musical works and their producers? How do they circulate? I think that there's a certain, chicken and egg kind of relationship which comes first. Because in these narratives, sometimes they originate from the press, as in somebody reads it, as you will soon see what a typical newspaper scene in Nigeria would be. So this is the key question. It's the centrality of these narratives, become very glaring in the way that government takes it. As a matter of fact, recently, only last month, a governor in Nigeria, Governor of Bayelsa State, set up a committee to examine, and prosecute people who regale rumors. And this committee, was set up, a very large committee comprising different people. And they were given the task of examining how this affects, because he had been a victim of the vector, of those kind of street stories. And he decided to not only criminalize it, but to bring people to book and to, inflict such maximum punishment that will make people, not be interested, or rather to just pass. So I see that the fear of street stories can be gleaned from the state's visual censorship of their transmission channels, the posting of regular public statements and billboards, and as I've said even now, just only last month, of committees, to examine that. You can imagine a committee on rumor mongering. I mean, it sounds really cool, but, it's freaky. So think that the kind of stories you tell one person, maybe if I was talking with Jenna at some pub, somebody listens, and it's possible that I could be prosecuted, for telling those kind of, it shows how important this is and why I'm interested in examining them. And the administration of oaths of secrecy on public servants, that's very well known across the world, because even in the United States of America, with its attention to freedom of expression, people also swear oaths of secrecy, and the WikiLeaks is a clear example of how governments, take the idea of protection of information seriously, and how citizens also challenge government by trying to untangle the secrets that they are keeping. And whereby they do not have access to it, sometimes they begin to retell their own stories and reimagine, those secrets. And this is a billboard on one of the streets in Nigeria. Government has spent money putting up this billboard because it thinks that people shouldn't tell those kind of stories, that it's dangerous. So don't peddle rumors. Always seek the truth and build a united society. This is a billboard posted discouraging rumor mongering. And then this is a typical, I wouldn't say typical now, because this is not really, this photograph was taken around about 2006. This is Lagos, the old Oshodi bus stop in Lagos. It's unbelievable if you see how vehicles are jammed. So the city fuels the narrative in a very oral society. Imagine the speed at which stories travel in such densely populated transit stations via face-to-face communication. So somebody tells one story in one of these buses. As it comes out, look at people milling around that. Lagos is a city of about 15 million people. So imagine the speed at which these kind of stories travel, in such densely populated places and transit centers as people move. And then this is a newsstand. The newsstand, is like a theater, and then there's something called the Free Readers Association, where people go to the newsstand, and because they are not so rich and they can't afford the newspapers, they can participate in conversations around the stories in the newspapers. Sometimes they actually rent the newspapers, whereby vendors allow them to read for about 5, naira or thereabout Nigerian naira. And then in some cases, some of them manage to read. I'm sure some Nigerians who are here are very familiar with this, and also in some other parts of Africa. So some of the stories originate from these kind of scenarios. And then these are transposed, to film. That's a still shot from one of the films that I discussed, Stubborn Grasshopper. You can see the parallel. Sometimes the films actually look like documentary. That's a similar, I just juxtaposed the images, one from a film, Stubborn Grasshopper, and the other a real-life scene in Lagos. What is fascinating about this is what I'd highlighted on a complex symbiotic circulation format that reminds one of the chicken and the egg paradox, which comes first. From street parliament in Kenya, for example, the idea of street parliament has become more institutionalized in what they call the People's Parliament. And you have People's Parliament where a whole lot of insurgency and some kind of political resistance, evolve. And so I see this, in line with some kind of street parliament or popular press, film, music, and so on. And I had a particular encounter with a guy called Smokey Joe, from which I began to think more seriously about this project, where I found Smokey Joe invoking the authority of print. And yet, journalists would invoke, the authority of the street, as in the epigraph that I started with, where if the rumor mills go to sleep, then there won't be communication. Radio Nigeria, so it's a very complex symbiotic kind of relationship. This also goes into literature. There are literary texts that are, keying into this or buying into this street story phenomenon. And there's a particular one, a character Lumber in Helen Habila's Waiting for an Angel. I don't go into any of those details. And then I just quickly show you the cover of, and I'll tell you the symbolism of this. You see that there's some kind of, there's commonality in the principal character in these two films. These are the two different films that I analyze in this paper. One is Stubborn Grasshopper, and this is the recurrent image of one of the worst dictators in Nigerian history, General Sani Abacha. The rumor around his death, the narrative, the unofficial narrative is that he died in the hands of Indian prostitutes who fed him poisoned apples. That's what you have there. The state goes on to insist that General Sani Abacha died of complications of heart attack. But in a battle of narratives between the street and the official channels of communication, the street wins because this is more like the popular narrative, the popular story about General Abacha's end. And look at how the filmmaker, virtually transcribes that street story, into that film. This is a more complicated exploration of a similar theme by a more accomplished filmmaker, Tunde Kelani. What he does there is he uses elements of folklore, and rather than showing, what appears very documentary and close, almost parallel reenactment of the street version of the story, builds a narrative around a king who usurps the throne, who wasn't supposed to be on the throne. And this is similar to contemporary Nigerian political history. And then just goes on and invites the military when there had been a resistance to his throne and he loses, invites the military to come help him reclaim the throne. And then what happens is that the general stages a coup. It's a parallel of how General Abacha emerged, but it's far more complicated because it uses elements of orature and of folklore. I will just speed through because, and then look at, this same motif of the general is in one of the cassettes. That cassette is virtually difficult to find. It took me about 5 years to find that particular cassette. I knew it existed, but when I wanted it, I couldn't get it, which is very symptomatic of what happens to these cultural products in post-colonial setting, where archiving, there's no emphasis on archiving. And then the other one is also a text that deals with the same general, the same story. But what it does is it begins to take different snippets of media constructions of the general, representations of the general. And then he now produces what is an imagined conversation with the general in hell. He begins to speak the general. There was no other place to go for this wicked and mean general than hell. And so he telephones him in hell and begins to have a fascinating conversation with him. I might not play it in detail, but this is a very recent one. I got this on my last field trip to Nigeria. The fuel subsidy had been one of the most moving catalysts for popular demonstrations in Nigeria. What happened was January last year, I think the government, just before people would return for New Year, said they removed the subsidies, the controversial subsidy on petroleum products. And so, prices of transit, commercial buses and everything skyrocketed, food stuff. And I was surprised to see that there's already, a narrative of that in a new work. This is 2012, very late last year that I got it. So I will give you a feel of this. Sorry, the audio is a bit loud, Oh, you turn it down? Okay, this what I'm going to play fits into what they call Yabis kind of music that is popularized by the Nigerian Afrobeat musician Fela Anikulapo Kuti. What it does is a satirical kind of musical form, that is Afrobeat, because it uses elements of traditional African beats. And more importantly, it is very scathing, critique of governance and of officials of the state. It's actually, this is unbelievable because happening only currently. I was surprised at the audacity of this guy in naming them. Sometimes Fela and some other people like Benga Adeboye can imagine this, be more creative, but this is a direct, and what you just listen to when you hear him, a transcript of some of the narratives that are all over the street. I once asked an editor, how do reporters get news stories? And he said that I have a background in journalism, I worked as a journalist for so many years. And he said that once he had an editorial meeting with reporters and he told them to bring story ideas. And one of the guys gave a story idea and he said to him, so what is the source of this story? And the guy said, well, the story is everywhere. So you can imagine a journalist, proposing that kind of story idea that is everywhere. Much of the narrative that this guy uses is everywhere around June 12th. Some of them, in fact, many of them are just not only scandalous, but libelous, if it were a more established institution. So I would listen to this and feel very free to dance when the music part of it goes in.
Thank you, Mr. President. Oga Goodluck, Jonathan Ibe. Our brothers and sisters go Christmas, may they celebrate with their family. Now, dear, our brothers and sisters, you increase fuel. Now, dear, we hear about fuel subsidy. When make so many of our brothers come, they sell their handset so that they can transport back to their hometown. We thank you. That one, I'm waiting you take compensate Nigerians for the free and fair election when we dedicate our time and sweat to vote for you. Thank you.
Now, I'm not stopping it.
Thank you, Mr. President. Oga Goodluck, Jonathan.
Oh my goodness, I did the wrong thing.
Our brothers and sisters go Christmas.
Sorry, I wanted to pause it and I rewound it.
Now, dear, our brothers and sisters, you increase fuel. Now, dear, we hear about fuel subsidy. When make so many of our brothers come, they sell their handset so that they can transport back to their hometown. We thank you. That one, I'm waiting you take compensate Nigerians for the free and fair election when we dedicate our time and sweat.
Okay.
Stops it completely and starts from the beginning. This is the pause.
Okay. So what he does is he provides, a context, he provides, like it's like a lecture actually, but he provides a context, before getting into the serious business of diatribe against various institutional representations of power in Nigeria.
To vote for you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Jay, you are a disappointing fellow.
Mr. Goodluck Jonathan is a disappointed person to this country. He don't care what you want to preach. When go make us reason with you, because so many presidents don't preach about this fuel subsidy, and at the end they go steal and embezzle the money. So you are a disappointed fellow to this country. Mikey Jare.
Now that's Afrobeat. This is standard.
It never reached 5 years when you stop to the Ando Chalk. When you come out as a lecturer, and it not go reach another 5 years, you will.
Okay, we don't have much time to take it. What it just simply says, it provides some kind of very controversial biography of the president. You know, you have been a teacher. It's not been long. You said that you dropped the chalk for politics and so on and so forth. And then he begins to call in some of the most important figures in contemporary Nigerian leadership, you know, questioning their authority. Now, as I said earlier on, what is really interesting, especially for me, is that much of what he says, some of them are lies. You know, they're just invented. You know, it takes some kind of liberty with the truth. But indeed, a great deal of rumors are like that. You know, but I'm not so much interested in how factual they are. I'm interested in their resonance, in their significance, you know, as a mode of expression and also of political resistance. And then sometimes the state uses that for compromise. We are short on time, and I'll just take my last paragraph. One of the biggest challenges facing artists under the kind of suffocating post-colonial condition experienced in Nigeria is how to engage sociological realities without compromising the artistic integrity of their works by turning their texts into cheap propaganda, either against or for the state. So it's a very difficult kind of medium to work with. Cognizant of the possibility, the state has also turned to culture to sustain hegemonic control. In recognition of the conflictual nature of the cultural text in the post-colony, Karim Baba points out that, quote, authoritarian governments which formerly attempted to control the media through monopoly and censorship are now less able to do so. Although, and this is evidenced by this kind of work, before now the guy would be in jail right away. Although the threats to freedom of expression and the impediments to a genuinely popular media operating in the interest of the people remain. But that notwithstanding, as Baba adds, cultural producers are still able to enact that kind of, quote, acerbic criticism, hilarious mockery, and mesmerizing tales of wrongdoing in high places that I discuss in this paper through popular media. What is more, these performances quickly spread from one medium and genre to another, creating a politically charged super medium continually refreshed by gossip. And that's the end of my presentation. Okay, we don't have much time, but we can take some questions or comments. I think what unites the three presentations are essentially, could you come over here? Yeah. Or you don't, there's no, I think you can answer from where you are actually. Yeah. The fascinating is the whole idea of mobility. And Martin has just you know, got a contract for a new series with Palgrave on mobility studies. And so it's what unites, whether it's about the movements of slaves, you know, to diasporas, or migrations, or even of text migrating from one cultural platform to the other, or within urban space, or even across countries or continents. It's so fascinating. One would like to hear your thoughts or questions or comments. So feel free at this point to respond to the presentation. Any questions? Oh, yes, please.
I would just like the panelists to reflect on their presentation in the light of the other presentations.
Oh,
mobility is an obvious connecting theme, but like, well, for example, maybe you two in particular, the sense to which those flows are themselves sustained. So I mean, it's as you see the chicken and egg, right? The flows are sustained by the gossip in the rumor mill, as much as the rumor mill is sustained by the flows.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not really sure what you point at in our presentation.
Oh, like just maybe like what are the stories that circulate?
Yeah,
in those flows of people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
what are stories about migration and about the border and about policing tactics and about employers and about, you know.
Yeah. And I think also this little story of pointing out Al-Kasaba, the Moorish fortress, and then on the other side completely ignoring actually the historical context of the whole thing. And what I didn't mention is, for example, that there's also a lot of if you would go to Morocco, to Harare, for example, and talk with people on the street, they have, of course, a lot of stories to tell about the other side and how difficult it is. And some have been there, some know people, and there's a lot of rumors, and rumors are also very important because, for one point, all these towers that were erected at night, or also this wind energy towers that are there along the straits. At night they are lighted up, and many people, there's a rumor actually that this is like, it's not a joke, that this is robots at night controlling the border, and people are scared to death. They get into this robots instead. So I learned about this a bit, and of course there are stories and storytelling about crossing or failing, and it's very important, I guess. So.
Yeah, do you have any? Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, Nduka, it's a question for you. I'm just thinking about the proposed work you talked about going from Lagos to Nairobi to Cairo. Like, how do you practically collect data, it's data on these rumors? Like, do you ride around with a tattoo, like, listening for them? Or do you talk to people, like, I don't like the word methodology, but how are you, like, conceiving of gathering, I guess, or tracking the flows of those rumors?
Okay, just a moment, please. Okay, what I wanted, yes, it's a very important question that you asked. As a matter of fact, one of the most challenging aspects has been in the area of methodology. You know, not just in terms of the practicality of the research and space. I wouldn't even have thought about making that kind of movement if I didn't get the kind of funding that I have had. I have been fortunate with funding from the University of Alberta, you know, through the Killam Scholarship and so on. And so this has given me some kind of space and resource, you know, to do that. What I plan to do is I am not approaching my work, you know, from a social science point of view, in which I need to gather a whole lot of data and begin to analyze them. I am saying this more located within the humanities, more, you know, of an artistic project. So it's not like, which is why I said I'm not really interested in how factual the narratives are. It's important because I'm looking at the themes, but I'm approaching them also more importantly as work of art. And so what I'm interested in visiting those places, because it is possible to go ahead and conclude my research and do a book on this, and then anybody can make the comparisons, you know, across different places. But what I'm interested in doing is seeing how some of this representation is, you know, if you like, a little journalist, you know, in terms of reporting, is like a reporter's diary. You know, that's the sense in which I'm approaching it. Because I also associate myself with some of the views about field trips in Africa especially, you know, or the whole idea of people visiting a place for just a couple of days and hoping to write any authoritative study on the place. That's very, very difficult to do. As somebody who has about 15 years experience in journalism, I have the tools to engage the specific areas that I want to do. The challenge is to distill what aspects of it to incorporate into my research. And I want to listen to, the point that you made actually has been back and forth between me and the ethics committee here, you know, because I have had a hard time trying to explain to people who divide the disciplines, you know, either into methodologies of social scientific research. My work is not the kind of work that Martin, for example, is doing. I'm approaching with a certain leverage as an artist. And so I am looking at, you know, I want to listen, hear some of these stories firsthand rather than imagine them or reading them in books. I want to have the feel of the physical street, because the street can be conceptualized either as a physical space or as an imagined space that exists in the mind. So, and then I also know that, especially for Kenya, for example, there are a lot of studies that are there already. I make these cross-references already in my research, but I'm not content with that. I want to visit the places, talk to the people, you know, feel the streets, you know, enter the pubs. In Nigeria, I want to feel the shebeen, it's enough for me to make a reference and then to invoke Ginger Day, but a visit to the place allows me to, you know, to smell the place. I want to be able to write about the smell or the shebeens, the smell or the matatu, rather than, you know, depending on other literatures on it. And so it's not more of a quantitative kind of analysis that requires that kind of collection of data. This is the way I'm approaching my work. You know, it's more qualitative, by which it means, you know, I'm not looking at how I can measure how many people tell these stories. I'll be fortunate if I can record real life stories, because indeed there is some kind of danger in the kind of research that I'm doing. You know, you couldn't enter some places where people are using substances and you're listening to the narratives and you're telling them, you know, you want to obtain, you know, data from them. You know, I was nearly mobbed in Lagos, you know, in the Ikeja bus stop, while I was taking photographs in a bus station, even when I had obtained permission from the head of that station that I was doing research, and he had accepted and, you know, read my research and whatever to them. So yes, it's a challenge, but as I said, you know, I'm looking at a very nuanced methodological approach to it. I hope that I succeed, you know, when I tease out the kind of approach that I'm working. I know there's a little gamble to the approach, but I am very interested in taking that risk as long as it doesn't put me in any harm's way. Let's see how then we'll come back to it.
Be careful in Johannesburg, because some of the stories are about foreigners, right? Very, and it's not.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a safe space necessarily.
Yeah. In fact, some of the spaces are not safe. That's true, and so that raises even questions of methodology, you know, and of ethics, which I acknowledge. I think, as far as ethics is concerned, here we've reached almost a common ground now, you know, in handling it back and forth, because sometimes they're formulaic. You know, the ethics is formulaic. You're giving this form as Paul would, the kind of forms that we sign. You know, they are formulaic. And when you do research that teases the boundary, you know, crosses the boundary, I think it requires a certain degree of creativity to be able also to set, you know, what may be standards or guide for people who want to traverse that kind of area. Thanks very much. I hope to, in any of those places, you know, link up with some journalists and some street people, you know. I have had to write, when I was a journalist, report a shrine, Fela's shrine, and there, you know, a lot of people abuse substances and it's dangerous. In order to do it, I pretended to be you know, one of them, and that was how I was able to get some of the information that I used. But I would be glad to hear more of your thoughts on that and suggestions. I'm open to suggestions on dealing with the situation, and so thanks for the advice you gave. It's very well taken.
Another thing to also just quickly note from my own experience, most of the spaces that we see as really treacherous and threatening to go to researcher and people, the subject that you're researching with, is that most of these people become highly protective of you as a researcher once you engage with them. True. My experience in the Niger Delta, where I was working with young people who had picked up AK-47s against the Nigerian state and oil company, was the most treacherous place to go to, to take a boat into the creeks. And then suddenly, I discovered that these boys were obsessed with protecting me. Yeah. You know, so here was I, concerned from the outset of the institution, concerned about the fact that I was going to endanger myself. And then suddenly I was struck by young people. So I said to one of them, why are you people so interested in? They have to be sure that I boarded the flight. This is because people know that you're here. If something happens to you, they will hold us. Yeah. So we want to protect you.
And you're not an enemy.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that you've been in Swisher, you have to say protect.
So it could be that in most of these places, even though they're very dangerous, once you can cultivate trust, it becomes actually very safe to navigate.
I'm not sure that urban South Africa, where occasionally they round up on foreigners and kill them, burn them alive, is a safe space for foreign people. You need to be careful about where you go. And choose neighborhoods which are maybe more international, cosmopolitan, and African
Even for stars, you know, look at Lucky Dube. I mean, it's very unlikely.
South Africa
Yeah,
is quite.
so I
Yeah,
do
with South Africa
recognize that.
specifically.
Thanks a
Well,
lot.
perhaps that's where there's always this rhetoric of exceptionalism to South Africa. So in relation to violence, perhaps it's an exception.
I wanted to ask you because I didn't get it. These committees still exist. This, you know, who is spreading rumors, and we crack down on the people spreading rumors.
In fact, I can put it out. It was just inaugurated last month.
But how do you avoid, for example, in your research, actually posing someone or putting someone at risk? You know, someone you talk on the bus, whatever, and suddenly then gets. Or I mean, I don't think you run around with a Carleton formula form to sign.
Thanks. I should take note of that. I should tell the ethics people that you have to protect some of your subjects.
How can you protect them? I mean, in such a context.
Again, because the methodology does not necessarily require naming them.
Okay. Yeah. But you could be. I mean, you could be caught by the police yourself, and then forced to tell who it was.
No, I think that it's like that. You know, even with journalism, you're not obligated to disclose your source.
But in Cairo, for example, they would listen to you. I mean, they would catch you in. I mean, this is true. I mean, if you happen to be around the wrong guy, right? The Secret Service or whatever.
Well, I think there is associated with a whole lot of humanistic studies of this nature, as Paul, would suggest. As a matter of fact, there is an interesting story that just broke out in Nigeria around Boko Haram. The fundamentalists, homegrown terrorism. There's a journalist who's been reporting them from inception, and he knows them inside out and broke the news. And the state wanted to interrogate him and all of that. And he wouldn't cooperate to the extent of revealing details of these people that he knows, because for him it was purely a professional kind of experience. He wasn't a member. In fact, they first suspected that he was a member of the Boko Haram sect. Finally, they did not. But things got to a turn to the extent that the state now invited him to be a member of a committee, for amnesty or for Boko Haram, because the people they couldn't identify them. They are just like the air in some cases, apart from the ringleaders who are the public faces of them. And so there are times in which the state recognizes that the only way you can penetrate someone is going through some of the researchers. And so it's not unlikely that instances when professors are also spies for the state, undercover agents and stuff like that. I would ask you, yes, go ahead. I wanted to ask you one question, but we'll hear you and then.
Just quickly, I think what you're doing is there's this rumor stuff is really the antithesis to scholarly work. But I think what you mentioned, the artistic approach will be really helpful to you. I think it would be really a shame if you didn't use your journalism skills and maybe in terms of disseminating your research, you do a mock tabloid or some sort of creative interpretation of what you're doing to kind of counterbalance this sort of you're doing academic research, but your subject matter is so opposite in a sense to that. So I would hope to see you use those journalism skills, even though academia wants to stifle you from being creative. I would hope that you would find a way of bringing it.
Yeah, thanks. I'm also thinking about using the humanities for some of the texts.